Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in for Elaine Quijano tonight. It's good to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us. President Biden spent the afternoon in a conservative part of a reliably Democratic state, Crystal Lake, Illinois. He was there pitching his plans to increase spending on infrastructure and families.
To truly win the 21st century and once again lead the world, to truly build an economy from the bottom up and the middle out, to truly deal everybody in this time, we need to invest in our people. We need to invest in our people. That's why, in addition to the bipartisan infrastructure agreement that I believe we're going to get done, I'm here to make a case for the second critical part of my domestic agenda. It's a combination of parts of my American Jobs Plan that were essential and not included in the bipartisan infrastructure plan, as well as my American Families Plan.
The plan is polling well with the American people, but the president is working to maintain a fragile alliance within his own party. Meanwhile, the CDC says the Delta variant is now the dominant strain of COVID-19 here in the United States. On Tuesday, the White House renewed its push to encourage more Americans to get vaccinated, but they announced no new real changes in terms of incentives. Just under 50% of the U.S. population is now fully vaccinated. And earlier, President Biden met with advisors to discuss that recent spate of cyber attacks targeting American companies and political organizations. On Tuesday, the Republican National Committee said one of its contractors was hacked last week. It happened after nearly 1,000 global companies were breached in the largest ransom attack on record. Both of the attacks are believed to be perpetuated by separate groups in Russia. The RNC says that none of its data was compromised. And on Capitol Hill, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has enough lawmakers to move forward with a January 6th Capitol riot investigation. Republicans blocked plans for a bipartisan commission just over a month ago, and so far, just 2 Republicans have been able to join the select committee out of the 5 allotted seats. And it remains to be seen whether Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy will appoint any additional Republicans to join them. This comes as Capitol Police say the threats targeting lawmakers are up 107% since last year. For more, let's bring in Weijia Jiang, Philip Bump, and Oma Seddiq. Weijia is CBS News senior White House correspondent. Philip is national correspondent for The Washington Post, and Oma is politics reporter for Business Insider. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Weijia, I want to start with you at the White House and the cybersecurity threats that we're seeing. What do we know about President Biden's meeting that he held on this issue here Wednesday?
So the White House is characterizing this meeting this morning as an internal national security update that President Biden asked for several weeks ago. So even though it falls on the heels of that massive ransomware attack, they are careful not to link it directly to that. But certainly you can imagine it came up because of the timing. But the White House and sources here say that it was really an opportunity for the president to continue his conversation with his advisors and experts about how to curb these attacks, especially because there have now been a string of them that have impacted U.S. businesses. Today, the press secretary, Jen Psaki, mentioned that these attacks are nothing new. She wanted to stress that point, but said what is different is the level of talks between the U.S. and Russia. So even though the intel community has not assigned attribution to Russia for that latest attack, she is the one that is bringing up that separately that conversation is happening at very high expert levels after the president met with Vladimir Putin last month to sort of call on him to curb the number of attacks by holding those inside Russia, those cyber hackers, accountable. So we don't know very many specifics about the conversation this morning, but we can imagine that that was certainly at the top.
Yeah, it certainly puts a spotlight back on that meeting that they held last month. Philip, I want to turn to you. On Tuesday, as I mentioned, the Republican National Committee said that one of its tech providers was hacked, most likely by Russian intelligence agents. Remember, this is the same group that attacked or that hacked the DNC in 2016, and it's also believed to be behind last year's SolarWinds attack targeting federal agencies. So as we're kind of thinking about this and looking at this and thinking about that meeting that Biden had with Putin last month, month. What is the White House doing about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, it's a really, I mean, we've all been used to the internet now for several decades, but it's important to remember this is a very new style of geopolitical tension, right? I mean, that Russia has figured out this way in which it can exert a lot of power against the United States, both as the United States government and also the institutions within the United States itself. And it's not really clear how one responds to that. Is this a criminal act? Do you respond through law enforcement mechanisms? Is this an act of hostility or aggression akin to a war? I mean, what is the way in which you actually treat this thing? I mean, obviously, if we saw Russians linked to the Russian government coming in and breaking into the RNC, we'd have some sense of what that meant and what that looked like. Here, though, it seems sort of different from a tactile sense. It's not the same sort of thing. And I think part of this challenge is, in addition to having to obviously try and prevent this from happening, it's not really clear diplomatically how one responds to situations like this. We saw Biden when he had that meeting with Russian President Putin. He said, here are certain things that if you touch, that's a red line for us. We're not clear what those things necessarily were, but it certainly doesn't seem as though Russia broadly was dissuaded by that conversation. And it's not really clear beyond trying to put in whatever roadblocks you can, how the United States as an institution, as a government, can respond to it.
That's right. And we just point to what's happening behind the scenes that we might not be able to see at this point. Right. Oma, I want to turn to you and kind of focus on Capitol Hill for a moment, because for weeks, lawmakers have said that progress is being made on negotiations on a lot of different things, from police reform to infrastructure. But I can't help but think how tight the calendar is getting. The clock is really ticking in terms of the midterm elections coming up. So does it seem like any of these things have a chance of actually passing, kind of given that narrow calendar?
Right, that's a very good point. The clock is ticking, but these issues, such as democratic priorities, including policing, voting rights, reforms that mainly progressives want to see Biden pass under his agenda, there's still a big appetite for these things to come into play before the 22 midterm elections. There remains pressure on the White House, namely to bring up these issues back to the negotiating table after Republicans sort of blocked these efforts in the Senate. In terms of infrastructure, we saw, as we saw in the clip earlier, Biden was pitching today in Illinois to voters about, sort of what he has described as human infrastructure, covering areas like covering social policy areas like elder care, child care, education, housing, health care. And so these are a lot of his priorities that he wants to see in a bigger infrastructure package after it had been cut out of this bipartisan deal reached 2 weeks ago between Biden and a group of senators made up of both Republicans and Democrats on more of the physical infrastructure elements of his agenda. So, funds for roads, bridges, public transport. Negotiations for both of those infrastructure packages could take weeks, if not months, to be finalized. So there remains a lot of work to be done on Capitol Hill. There's a lot of pressure for these priorities to be fulfilled. And so we'll have to see how that process plays out over the coming days.
And Philip, all of these issues that Oma is mentioning are kind of now at the forefront as the pandemic has kind of receded from the big headlines, at least. But this is a White House that is still trying to get people vaccinated. That's still a big goal of this White House. And you've been reporting on the correlation between people's political views and these vaccination rates. Can you tell us what that data shows?
Sure. So the Washington Post conducted a poll recently with ABC News that looked at people's reticence or willingness to get the vaccine. And we saw a pattern that we've seen consistently, essentially, since the beginning of the year, which is that Republicans are far more likely to say that they don't plan or they definitely will not get vaccinated. And so, we tend to look at polls and say, okay, well, how reliable are polls? Generally, they're pretty reliable, but people tend to be skeptical of polls. But if you look at the actual real world, if you look at the states where there is less vaccination, those are states that tended to vote for Donald Trump in the 2020 election. There's a strong correlation between the extent to which a state supported Donald Trump last year and the extent to which it is or is not vaccinated. And so that really shows that there is some political, there are politics underlying this lack of a willingness to actually go out and get vaccinated. And the challenge for Biden, obviously, is that there is this variant, the Delta variant, that is spreading quickly. It's now the major variant in the United States. The very last thing Joe Biden wants to have happen is for there to be a massive flare-up in the number of cases of the coronavirus, and there have to be some sort of reaction from the federal government. He doesn't want to have any sort of, attempt to have a stay-at-home order or anything along those lines. He recognizes, I'm sure, that the politics of that would be extremely bad, even among Democrats. And so he's really hoping that to just go out and encourage people to get this vaccine. Elsewhere in the world, people aren't as lucky to have it available in the way the United States is, and yet there is still this reticence, a lot of which happens to overlap with politics.
Yeah, Weijia, I want to talk a little bit more about that and Biden's role here, because we've seen polls so far show that there is widespread support for how Biden has handled this pandemic. But how far does that really get him at this point? And especially since you have all of these other big agenda issues kind of coming back into the forefront.
Well, to Philip's point, that really depends on how this unfolds with the Delta variant and other possible variants that could, spread across the country and cause a shutdown of any kind, because the president and the White House has made very clear from day one that you cannot divorce these twin pandemics of the coronavirus and the economy. And so at the end of the day, he is really well aware that when it comes to political gains, people care about how their daily lives are, whether they can pay the bills, whether they feel like they have that stability financially beneath them. And so that's why it's so critical for the pandemic to get under control, because now we are seeing that the economy is starting to make a comeback of sorts. And that's why he continues to push this infrastructure plan, his jobs proposal, to grow that even further. And so I think it depends on those states, because the experts that we've talked to as well point out that these are all red areas. And at this point, it's very difficult to see how you can change their minds, because it's not a matter of access, about whether someone can get the vaccine. At this point, it's about changing their minds and their philosophy and the politics around getting a shot. And that is far trickier than making the doses available to people.
Yeah, and a little bit more about this infrastructure proposal. As we mentioned, Biden was in Crystal Lake, Illinois, and anytime the president goes somewhere, there has to be some kind of significance to where he's going and why. Can you tell us about maybe the significance of the places that he visited today and places he's been recently?
So this particular county is part of a swing district, but most recently it is Trump country. The president lost, and the White House acknowledged that. The press secretary said that he ran, saying that he was not going to just represent people who voted for him, but Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And this certainly is an example of that. But the more important context is that the piece of his proposal he was selling today was the so-called human infrastructure part of his plan. And he even said today that he was going to have to tackle this with that budget process called reconciliation, which at the end of the day means Democrats can pass a loan without a single Republican. And so we've seen already with his other legislative items that in order to get around that, they tend to say, even though we don't have the support of Republicans on Capitol Hill, we have the support of Republicans in the real world, in America, which is exactly why he is taking his argument right to people, right to voters, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, to try to gain support for his proposal, which he believes resonates with anyone, whether they are in a blue or red area.
And that could be helpful for the midterms as well. I mean, speaking of the midterms, Philip, in the lead up to next year's election, the Washington Post, your colleagues at the Washington Post, have been reporting that some Republican candidates are basing their campaigns on former President Trump's fraudulent election claims. Can you give us a sense of how many people we're talking about here? And this comes, of course, as there have been lots of recounts, lots of audits that have all confirmed Joe Biden's win.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to lead with the point you just made, which is that there's literally no credible evidence that there was any significant fraud in the 2020 election. And yet, this is still a potent political argument for a lot of Republicans for a few reasons. One, obviously, is that you have Donald Trump out there promoting it. And since he's been promoting it since November 3rd, 2020, you have a lot of Republicans who've already fallen in line. And so there is for anyone who wants to stand up and say, actually, this isn't the case, you're essentially going against the entire party. But there are two other complicating factors. The first is that you have conservative media, which is scrambling all over itself to say the same thing. That you see, for example, Fox News, which came out of the gates on November 3rd saying, okay, it looks like Joe Biden won Arizona. He's probably going to be the president. And it had this huge backlash from Trump and Trump supporters. And they have since pivoted a lot to culture wars and pivoted a lot to actually sort of nodding and winking at this idea that the election may have been stolen, which, again, it wasn't, because they recognize that that's where the market has been over the course of the past few months. But then, of course, there's the fact that what we're talking about here is primary fights. And primary fights are made up of voters who tend to be more ideological, in this case, more deeply conservative. And the more deeply conservative you are, the more strongly supported Donald Trump. And so the people that are likely to come out and vote in Republican primaries next year are also people who are much more likely to be adhering to Donald Trump's particular worldview on this issue, and therefore more likely to think that the election was stolen, which, just to tie this up into the bow, did not actually happen.
Right, and it's interesting, too, to think about that in the context of yesterday, because that was the 6 month, marked 6 months since that insurrection, some Republicans are still trying to downplay what happened there. And Oma, I want to get into that a little bit with you, because, we're seeing the fencing come down around the Capitol a little bit, but the Capitol Police Department has announced the reopening of regional offices to investigate increasing number of threats against lawmakers. What do we know about this this kind of lingering threat level in the wake of that January 6th attack?
That's right. The Capitol Police announced this week that they're opening up regional offices starting in California and Florida, where they're seeing an increase in a number of threats against lawmakers. So these offices are meant to serve as enhanced security, to serve as protection for these lawmakers, which they've seen an increase in violent threats against them. I believe the increase was about 107% over the past year. And notably, it has been increased since the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And so what these regional offices, is starting in California and Florida, those are home to the home districts of prominent lawmakers, such as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi representing California, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy representing California. And so that's where they're seeing these major threats come from. They're still spread across the country, so more offices will be made in different areas. But right now, this is just part of a broader effort to, strengthen safety measures, protect lawmakers amidst this increase in threats.
A good reminder that even 6 months later, these threats are still lingering. Weijia Jiang, Philip Bump, and Oma Seddiq, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your time.